Imagine the billions of years-long saga of life on Earth as a colossal photo album. As you turn the pages, you witness the birth, rise, and fall of strange and magnificent creatures. But there's something odd about this album. The pages immediately following one of the most critical moments in history, life's epic leap from water to land, are blank. It's as if someone ruthlessly ripped out 15 million years worth of pages right from the most exciting chapter of the book. To continue our journeys into this mysterious past, you can become a member and enjoy special privileges by clicking the Join button on the Human Stories channel. You can also directly support our channel by clicking the Thanks button located under the 3 dots below the video. So, what happened to the planet during those 15 million years? Did evolution take a vacation for a while? Or was a darker, greater secret hidden behind the curtain in the depths of history? This massive gap is a mystery that has puzzled scientists for decades, and you'll be amazed when you learn how everything was solved as we pull back the curtain on this enigma. Now, hold on tight, because on this journey, you'll see, step by step, how an ordinary insurance salesman filled this enormous gap that preoccupied the scientific world for 60 years, all by diverting a small creek in Scotland. You'll witness how a handful of muddy bones exposed one of the biggest lies about our planet's history. For decades, the scientific world tried to put this gap on a logical footing. Perhaps they just hadn't found the right rocks yet. Perhaps the fossils were buried deep in impossible-to-reach places. Or perhaps the geological conditions of that period were extremely unfavorable for fossil preservation. Some researchers even suggested that perhaps there indeed was very little life on land during that period. The theory that low oxygen levels had essentially brought evolution to a halt was one of the most accepted. It was as if someone had turned down the planet's thermostat and suffocated life. However, there was one man who called this scientific impasse and these theories nonsense, and this person was not a professor in an ivory tower, but a stubborn Scottish fossil hunter who had tried his hand at everything in life. Stan Wood, born in Edinburgh in 1939, left school at 14 to work in shipyards, served in the Merchant Navy, and eventually became an insurance salesman. But at one point, the sense of curiosity flowing in his veins led him down a completely different path: fossil hunting. And this was more than a passion, it was an obsession. So much so that he was reckless enough to literally divert a river to achieve his goal. In the late 1970s, Stan was scouring the Scottish borders with his colleague Tim Smithson from Cambridge University, searching for a needle in a haystack. They had a strong feeling. If Romer's Gap fossils were anywhere, that place had to be Scotland, because the right kind of rocks from that period were exposed in Scotland. Moreover, 360 million years ago, Scotland was not the cold and wet place we know today. Located almost on the equator, it was a warm, humid, swampy paradise for the first terrestrial animals. And one day, Stan found what he was looking for. He named the spot Will's Hall. This was an unremarkable-looking spot near the village of Churnside in Scotland, where a small river named Whiteater Water had cut through millions of years of rock layers. But what Stan found there in 2008 would cause an earthquake in the world of paleontology. What stood before him were incredibly complete fossils coming directly from the middle of Romer's Gap, a rich ecosystem containing 4-limbed first land animals, tetrapods, plants, millipedes, scorpions, and fish had emerged to break the 15-year silence. One of the most magnificent fossils found was nicknamed Rebo because of its prominent ribs. This creature, about the size of a large dog, was definitely designed for life on land.
It had the five-toed foot structure that became the standard for all subsequent terrestrial vertebrates ever since. Its leg bones were strong enough to support the animal's weight out of the water. This was not a legged fish. This was one of the conquerors of the land. But the craziest part of the story was just beginning.
To fully access the fossils at Wills Hall, they had to move the entire river. Imagine a group of paleontologists literally redirecting a river in Scotland in 2015 to extract fossils from the bedrock beneath it. It was like a scene out of an adventure movie. The only difference was more mud and more grant applications. As news of Stan's discovery spread, other teams also began finding Romer's Gap fossils in Scotland. New sites were discovered at Bournemouth, along the River Tweed near Coldstream, and even around Tantallon Castle. Suddenly, that supposedly dead zone in the fossil record was brimming with life. By 2016, researchers had identified 5 new species of primitive tetrapods from these Scottish sites, with more being studied. These weren't just random bone fragments. Skulls, limb bones, vertebrae. The material was rich enough to truly understand what these animals looked like and how they lived. And what they found completely changed the story. These animals were not primitive legged fish struggling to survive on land. They were sophisticated early terrestrial animals. Some fully terrestrial, others dividing their time between water and land. They had already developed effective respiratory systems, proper gaits, and the fundamental body plans that would dominate terrestrial life for the next 300 million years. The question that might pop into your mind is this: if all these animals were living during Romer's Gap, why was it called a gap in the first place? Where were all these fossils? The answer, it turns out, was quite literally in the air, or rather, in the lack thereof. Recent geochemical studies on rocks from this period revealed a surprising fact. Oxygen levels in the atmosphere during Romer's Gap were unusually low. Compared to the 21% we have today, there was perhaps only 13 to 15% oxygen in the atmosphere. This might not seem like a huge difference, but when you're the first land animal trying to breathe air instead of filtering oxygen from water, every percentage point is vital. Lower oxygen levels meant that terrestrial life could only be supported by specific types of environments. Coastal areas, river deltas, places with good water circulation, and perhaps slightly higher elevations. Most of the planet's land was a hostile place for air-breathing animals. But here's what makes the story truly interesting. Scotland, 350 million years ago, was exactly the kind of place where terrestrial life could flourish. It was a tropical coastal plain, located in a high humidity region, full of rivers and deltas. It was a perfect refuge for the animals transitioning from water to land. The fossil gap was not caused by the absence of life, but by the fact that life was concentrated only in these small oases, and the conditions for fossilization were poor across the rest of the planet. And speaking of massive gaps in the geological record, Romer's Gap isn't even the biggest one we know. There's a phenomenon called the Great Unconformity, which makes a 15 million year gap look like a coffee break. First noticed by John Wesley Powell in the Grand Canyon in 1869, the Great Unconformity represents over 1 billion years of missing rock layers in some places. One day you're looking at rocks about 3 billion years old, and the next layer is only 550 million years old. That's not a gap. It's like ripping out 2/3 of the book at the root. Recent research suggests that this was not a single massive erosion event, but likely a series of actions linked to the formation and breakup of ancient supercontinents. When continental plates collide and separate, they create mountain ranges that scrape away layer after layer of rock and the fossil record within that was eroded over hundreds of millions of years. When you think about this, it's quite humbling. We like to imagine that the fossil record gives us a complete portrait of the history of life. But the truth is, we're working with perhaps less than 1% of all the species that have ever lived.
Most of the story is missing, and sometimes we don't even know the questions we need to ask about the gaps. The discovery of life during Romer's Gap fundamentally changed our thinking about the evolution of terrestrial life. It turned out that the transition from water to land was not a slow, gradual process spanning tens of millions of years. These animals had solved walking, air breathing, and life on land relatively quickly, and then spent the supposedly empty 15 million years diversifying and adapting to different terrestrial environments. This also means that many major evolutionary innovations, like the five-toed limb structure, efficient lung systems, and specialized land animal body plans, are much older than we thought. The animals that emerged after Romer's Gap were not clumsy experiments, but the successful descendants of a pioneer lineage that managed to survive in harsh conditions. And this raises a fascinating question about what else might be hidden in the fossil record. How many other gaps are actually just periods where fossilization conditions were poor or where we simply haven't found the right rocks yet? Stan Wood's discoveries in Scotland proved that sometimes the most important fossils are sitting right under our noses, or in this case, under Scottish rivers. There is something quite astonishing in Stan Wood's story that goes beyond mere scientific discovery. Here we have a man with no formal training in paleontology who became one of the most important fossil hunters of the 20th century. Throughout his career, he discovered 29 species. He revolutionized our understanding of early land life and inspired a whole generation of paleontologists. Stan died in 2012, just a few years after his discoveries at Wills Hall made headlines, but his work continues to bear fruit. Scientists are still studying the fossils he collected. They are making new discoveries from his sites. The Paleontological Society even established the Stan Wood Award in his honor in 2022. This story is living proof that science is not just about fancy equipment in university labs. Sometimes the biggest breakthroughs come from someone with sharp eyes, endless curiosity, and a willingness to spend years crawling through the mud to search for rocks that others have walked right past. When you look back at the whole story of Romer's Gap, it's really a story about the limitations of the fossil record and the ingenuity of the people who study it. For 60 years, one of the most important transitions in the history of evolution seemed to be a complete mystery. And then, a dedicated fossil hunter and his colleagues proved that the mystery was actually just a matter of looking in the right places. But this also highlights how much we still don't know. Despite all of Stan Wood's discoveries, we are still working with a tiny fraction of the life that existed during this critical period. Every new fossil sometimes fundamentally changes our understanding, and that's the beauty of paleontology. Just when you think you've solved the whole story, someone finds a fossil that forces you to reconsider everything. Romer's Gap went from being proof that early land life was sparse and struggling to being proof that terrestrial ecosystems were already diverse and sophisticated 350 million years ago. So the next time you hear about supposedly impossible gap in the fossil record, remember Stan Wood and Wills Hall. Sometimes the answer isn't that there was nothing there. Sometimes it's just that we haven't looked at the right river yet. The fossil record is full of holes, but those holes don't necessarily mean that life took a break. Most often, they are just a reminder that we are still learning to read the story written in the rocks. And once in a while, if we're lucky and persistent enough, we fill in one of those blank pages and discover that the story is much more amazing than we ever imagined.
We hope this journey has been impactful for you. You can support us by subscribing to the Human Stories channel and liking the video. See you in the shadows of the past.